Reading the Times for Thursday, January 23rd, 2020. In impeachment case, Schiff accuses Trump of trying to cheat in election, invoking the nation's founders and their fears that a self-interested leader might subvert democracy for his own personal gain. Mr. Schiff argued that the president's conduct was precisely what the framers of the Constitution had in mind when they devised the remedy of impeachment. One, he said, was as powerful as the evil it was meant to combat. If not remedied by this conviction in the Senate and removal from office, President Trump's abuse of his office and obstruction of Congress will permanently alter the balance of power among the branches of government, Mr. Schiff said in his opening remarks. In a series of speeches, Mr. Schiff and the 6 other impeachment managers asserted that the president pressured Ukraine to announce an investigation of former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr. and his son Hunter Biden, while withholding as leverage nearly $400 million in security aid to Kiev and White House meeting for the president. For now, the president's legal team must sit silently in the chamber as the president's House accusers have exclusive access to the microphone. We are not doing that. Stuck in Senate as their 2020 rivals have Iowa to themselves. The 3 candidates who have a shot at breakout performances in Iowa on February 3rd, Ms. Warren, Mr. Sanders, and Ms. Klobuchar, are suddenly stuck at the Senate impeachment trial in Washington, while the rivals have the campaign trail largely to themselves. It's not fair to ask if Joe has an advantage if he's not in Washington. On Wednesday, as the senators arrived at the Capitol for party lunch meetings before the trial started up again, Mr. Buttigieg was in Dubuque, comforting a woman seeking laws to speed the development of experimental drugs to treat her ALS. Speaking before an audience of hundreds, he seemed to go out of his way to describe the time he has spent in Iowa, citing voter after voter he has encountered in the state this past year, perhaps a pointed reminder that several of his rivals were absent. They're doing what they're supposed to do, he said, adding, I hope that people look more broadly than who would gain a political edge in Iowa during the Senate trial. 2 legal teams with contrasting strategies face off in the Capitol. They are trying to build a clear and coherent story around their theme that the president abused his power, delving into the details, putting up slides to summarize major points, and playing a well-organized selection of video clips of statements by Mr. Trump and by House witnesses. They have used their time to reinforce the House Republican theme that impeachment is a sham and unfair to Mr. Trump, urging the Senate to swiftly dispose of the case without subpoenaing any additional documents or testimony. Mr. Trump's White House counsel, Pat A. Cipollone, a longtime civil litigator, has been as combative as his clients. The president, both in angry letters he signed during the House phase declaring that the executive branch would not participate, and now in person on the Senate floor. How Jeff Bezos' iPhone X was hacked. The 2 men had previously communicated using the messaging platform, but Mr. Bezos, Amazon's chief executive, had not expected a message that day, let alone one with a video of Saudi and Swedish flags with Arabic text. The video, a file of more than 4.4 megabytes, was more than it appeared, according to a forensic analysis that Mr. Bezos commissioned and paid for to discover who had hacked his iPhone X. Hidden in that file was a separate bit of code that most likely implanted malware that gave attackers access to Mr. Bezos' entire phone, including his photos and private communications. Ron Dybert, the director of Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto, was not involved in the Bezos investigation, said the Amazon chief's situation was a reminder that the proliferation of commercial spyware is a global security problem for all sectors, from government and business to civil society. Over the years that he has run Amazon, Mr. Bezos has largely kept private. Chaos as militants overrun airfield, killing 3 Americans in Kenya. The Shabab have typically avoided American outposts and the technological superiority of the American military, instead attacking more exposed Kenyan and Somali troops in the hinterlands. On November 5th, the Shabab released a 52-minute video narrated by the group's leader, Abu Ubaidai, which he called for attacks against the Americans wherever they are, saying the American public is a legitimate target. According to one American official, the group likely has patiently watched the base and has selected their attack based on the Americans' well-established patterns. Wuhan, center of coronavirus outbreak, is being cut off by the Chinese authorities. Chinese authorities on Thursday morning closed off Wuhan, a city of more than 11 million people, and the epicenter of a pneumonia-like virus that has spread halfway around the world, by canceling planes and trains leaving the city and suspending buses, subway, and ferries with it. The Chinese authorities said that the measures in Wuhan were needed to effectively cut off the transmission of the virus, resolutely curb the spread of the epidemic, and ensure the safety and health of the people. They said they would later announce an end date for the restrictions. Who will think of the lives of those of us who are healthy in Wuhan? We are also afraid, wrote one user, who described herself as a designer living in Wuhan. Departing 2 shopkeepers, their cat, and part of Paris' soul. On a recent evening, Amar Sitayeb squeezed behind a tiny counter at the mini-mart that he and his older brother Ali have run for more than 35 years in the Marais district of central Paris. The purchases were mainly an excuse to spend precious moments bantering with the Sitayeb brothers, known to residents around the Rue Saint-Croix de la Bretanière, a boutique-studded Marais street, as the eyes, ears, and unofficial mayors of the area. Near the Sitayeb's shop, the Sandro Mahé and Claude Perlot clothing chains expanded under the ownership of American private equity firm KKR, before being taken over by the Chinese textile giant Shandong Roy. South Korea discharges soldier who underwent sex change surgery. The South Korean military on Wednesday decided to discharge a soldier who has undergone gender reassignment surgery but wanted to remain in military service as a female. The Center for Military Human Rights in Korea, a watchdog based in Seoul, the South Korean capital, that monitors rights violations within the military, publicized the case of the transgender staff sergeant last week. South Korea's Military Criminal Act outlaws anal sex and other indecent acts between servicemen, whether or not they take place on military property. Northern Ireland now has a government, but schools and hospitals are in crisis. Its dual leadership structure consists of 2 parties: Sinn Fein, which supports unification with the Republic of Ireland, and the Democratic Unionist Party, which wants Northern Ireland to remain part of the United Kingdom. Julian Smith, Britain's Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, defended the proposed financial package and urged the region's ministers to get on with it. Stormont's top priority is to save the health and social care service. Northern Ireland's Education Minister, Peter Weir, said last week that he would put £45 million from Government Education Enhancement Program towards improving 18 schools. Lawyers for Harry and Meghan warn British media over photos. Now, lawyers representing the couple, known as the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, have sent a letter to some British news outlets threatening legal action over the purchase and publication of photos of Meghan walking with her infant son Archie in a public park near a house that the couple rented in an exclusive suburb of Victoria, British Columbia. The letter, addressed to the Daily Mail and the Sun tabloids, was sent by Shillings, a law firm that is also representing Meghan in a separate legal case against another British tabloid, The Mail, on Sunday. The letter is the latest skirmish in a long-running privacy battle between the British royal family and the country's press. UK takes a major step toward Brexit. The government's move was condemned by Ruth Tanner, the head of humanitarian campaigns for Oxfam, who said it was a very sad start to the future of Britain, outside the European Union, that members of parliament have rejected the government's move was condemned by Ruth Tanner, the head of humanitarian campaigns for Oxfam, who said it was a very sad start to the future of Britain outside the European Union, that members of parliament have rejected the amendment to protect rights of lone child refugees coming to the UK from Europe. But having won the December general election with an 80-seat majority, Mr. Johnson has virtually complete control over Parliament and no longer has to worry about the sort of defeats he suffered routinely last year. Business leaders in several sectors have reacted with alarm to warnings from the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sajid Javid, that Britain will ultimately not align with the European Union rules. The European Union has not yet agreed on a mandate for the trade talks with Britain. As Australia burns, a climate change denier rallies the troops. As the country fears it is being condemned to a fiery future by heat and drought, Mr. Kelly has been gathering and goading a right-wing tribe under the banner of posts that shout in all caps, "Bushfires have nothing to do with climate change," or "Beware of climate alarmists, everything they tell you is a lie." Mr. Kelly, 56, insists that he's just trying to protect everyday Australians from higher energy prices and lost jobs in coal and other industries. The loyal soldiers of the fossil fuel industry, like Kelly, promote the talking points and incite a rabble. Many Australians, even climate scientists, dismiss Mr. Kelly as a political Falstaff, outrageous if powerless. Mr. Kelly embraced a lengthy interview with the New York Times after announcing, "I have to be careful because the Prime Minister told us not to talk to international media." Over the phone, Mr. Kelly argued that his enemies have called him a denier to make him sound like a Holocaust denier. This three-year-old may be smarter than you. The toddler Mohammed Hariz Nadzim was invited last week to join Mensa, a British society whose membership rules require an IQ in the top 2% of the population. Hariz's mother, Nur Anina Asikin, said on Instagram, "My mini brain box just got invited at his little age to be a part of Mensa," and congratulated her very, very clever son. Ann Clarkson, a Mensa spokeswoman, said in an email on Wednesday that a high IQ was like a toolbox. It gives children the equipment to learn, but they still have to put the effort and practice to become experts at something. Though all children are unique, she said, what makes Hariz different is his ability to learn very quickly and process information very fast. Child prodigies have long caused admiration and interest. A new virus spreads from China. Scientists see grim reminders. "We don't know how many people are infected," said Tariq Jesarevich, a spokesman for WHO. "The more you test, the more you will find people who are infected. We don't know if there are asymptomatic cases. If they are asymptomatic, are they contagious?" Broad studies to test for evidence of infection, past and present, would give a true picture of how many people have been exposed to the virus. SARS, which began in live animal markets in China in 2002, quickly spread to dozens of countries, infecting more than 8,000 people and killing nearly 800. Now more cases are emerging among people with no known exposure to the animal markets and in medical staff members caring for infected patients. China silences critics over deadly virus outbreak. What's left is an arrogant power, a bunch of messy information, and many fragile, isolated, and angry individuals. Even as the new virus spread through Wuhan, the government took pains to keep up appearances. The central government backed Wuhan's officials. Wang Guangfa, a prominent government and respiratory expert, told the state broadcaster China Central Television on January 10th that the Wuhan phenomena was under control and mostly a mild condition. 11 days later, he confirmed to Chinese media that he might have contracted the virus himself during an inspection of Wuhan. Ivanka Trump takes spotlight at Davos ahead of cabinet members. Ms. Trump used a news conference at Davos about reskilling workers to promote what she called the president's freedom agenda, which she claimed was chipping away at income inequality and bringing more women into the labor force. "That's close to 15 million students and workers," she said. 15 million lives impacted. 15 million families impacted. In an interview, Ms. Trump said she planned to continue talking about workforce development at home as part of a campaign message that will help her father. Ms. Trump views herself less as a political voice like her brother Donald Trump Jr., and more as someone who can mobilize voters to help her father through a focus on two issues the Democrats claim as their own: women's empowerment and the American workforce. Trump in Davos to talk trade, lashes out at enemies back home. Mr. Trump unleashed on Democrats and the news media in a wide-ranging news conference before leaving Davos, where he met with business and government leaders from around the world, to return to Washington, where impeachment overshadows all else. Mr. Trump called Representative Jerry Nadler of New York a sleaze bag and referred to Representative Adam Schiff, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, as a con job and a corrupt politician. The president referred to Mr. Schiff and other House impeachment managers as major sleaze bags and said he would love to attend his own trial in order to sit right in the front row and stare into their corrupt faces. But he acknowledged that his lawyers would most likely advise him against doing so. Mr. Trump's comments ran counter to the actions of the Senate Republicans, who have turned back Democrats' attempts to subpoena documents and compel White House officials to testify in the impeachment trial. Di Maio quits as five-star leader in Italy, deepening party's disarray. Behind the scenes, he was a trusted ally of Davide Casaleggio, a web entrepreneur and son of the party's other co-founder, who many say is the party's true power. In March 2018, under Mr. Di Maio's leadership, the party won 33% of the Italian vote and then formed a nationalist and anti-establishment coalition with Mr. Salvini's League. One is Alessandro Di Battista, a longtime party activist and firebrand who campaigned across Italy on his motorcycle and has called for the party to return to its anti-establishment roots. Starving lions in Sudan spur campaign to save them. Within hours of Mr. Salih's post, the Sudanese authorities, park officials, and local residents responded, providing urgently needed medicine and food. There is no available data on the number of lions in Sudan, but the International Union for Conservation of Nature lists African lions as a vulnerable species, with an estimated 20,000 alive today across the continent. The designation has also affected the relief efforts to support the lions, Mr. Salih said. Bezos' phone hack tied to Saudi Crown Prince puts new pressure on the kingdom. The Saudi embassy in Washington on Wednesday called the idea that the kingdom had hacked Mr. Bezos' cell phone absurd and did not respond to a request for comment about the hacking of Saudi dissidents. The hack of Mr. Bezos' phone came at the start of a 2-month period in mid-2018 when at least 4 Saudi dissidents living abroad reported having their devices hacked with technologies similar to that found to have been deployed against Mr. Bezos. At the photo was captioned, "Arguing with a woman is like reading the software license agreement. In the end, you have to ignore everything and click agree. Click I agree." At the time, Mr. Bezos and his wife were discussing divorce, which had been apparent to someone reading his text messages. World leaders gathering to mark Holocaust are urged to fight deadly cancer. Dozens of presidents, premiers, and potentates descended upon the Holy City on Wednesday in an extraordinary show of collective resolve to fight anti-Semitism, and a 95-year-old Holocaust scholar warned that such hatred threatened their countries with a deadly cancer. The gathering in Jerusalem, timed ahead of the Monday's 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, was orchestrated to focus even more on the present day with anti-Jewish violence and rhetoric spreading across Europe and North America. Germany's president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who had called World War II a German crime and apologized for the Holocaust, will also speak. For Israel, participation of so many world leaders is a point of pride. Only the funerals of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and President Shimon Peres attracted more, officials say. American journalist is arrested in Indonesia over visa issues. As a reporter for Manga Bay, Mr. Jacobson wrote articles about a paper company that illicitly set up a shell company to secretly clear forests and land, and another that analyzed the environmental records of the country's president, Joko Widodo. A letter of arrest dated Tuesday said that it was necessary to take Mr. Jacobson into custody for further investigation since he was strongly alleged to commit a crime based on sufficient initial evidence. The letter was signed by immigration officials and Mr. Jacobson. Mr. Arvin said that he did not know whether any information from the interviews had been published and that Mr. Jacobson had not been detained because of any article published by Manga Bay. Efforts to denuclearize North Korea will continue despite hardline minister, U.S. says. The State Department official shrugged off suggestions that Russian and Chinese diplomats had dissuaded North Korea from carrying out a major weapons test that American officials had expected, and that Mr. Kim had described as a possible Christmas gift for Mr. Trump. In December, Stephen E. Biden, the Deputy Secretary of State and main negotiator on North Korea, traveled across East Asia to discuss the North Korean sanctions with China and to indicate to North Korea that Americans were willing to continue talks. An earlier round of talks Mr. Biden had with North Korean officials in Stockholm in October ended badly after the North Koreans read from a long pre-written letter berating the Americans. What polling tells us about Bernie Sanders' choices? In an average of polls, Mr. Biden still leads by about 6 percentage points, but his advantage over Mr. Sanders has been cut in half over the last 3 months. These are the kinds of conditions that often contribute a late movement in primary contests, and Mr. Sanders has steadily risen in national and early state polls. A recent Washington Post Ipsos poll gave Mr. Biden a lead of 48% to 20% lead among black voters, less than Mrs. Clinton's commanding 80 to 20 advantage. Why Bernie Sanders went on the attack against Joe Biden? Over the weekend, Mr. Biden accused the Sanders campaign of deliberately distorting his record on Social Security, prompting Mr. Shakir to issue a scathing attack on Mr. Biden. As a group of reporters congregated around Mr. Biden at a campaign event in Mason City, Iowa on Wednesday, Ed O'Keefe of CBS News pressed Mr. Biden on why his campaign had continued to criticize Mr. Sanders, even after Mr. Sanders had apologized for a surrogate's op-ed. Mr. Sanders has also criticized Mr. Biden over support for the North American Free Trade Agreement from almost the moment Biden jumped into the race. Pete Buttigieg once led in Iowa. Can he get his groove back? Charnel Sanders, who collected a Buttigieg yard sign at his rally in Pella on Monday, said she had voted for Mr. Trump and now regretted it and planned to caucus for Mr. Buttigieg. Voters at Buttigieg rallies in recent days said they were weighing between him and Mr. Biden, between him and Senator Klobuchar, between him and Miss Warren, even between Mr. Buttigieg and Mr. Trump. Look at what they've done at South Bend. As he spoke, followed by the candidates, three friends, Jerry Rossman, Diana Springman, and Neil Ferguson, looked on in a building that featured the National Corn Empire Discovery Center. Mr. Springman, a retired bank regulator, Miss Springman, a retired bank regulator, said she supported Mr. Biden but was interested in Mr. Buttigieg for the future. Mr. Rossman, a farmer, said that his preferred candidate was Miss Klobuchar, but that Mr. Buttigieg could be a second choice, an important factor if Miss Klobuchar doesn't gain a threshold of support in her caucus, and voters must pick another candidate. In presidential first, Trump will attend anti-abortion March for Life. President Trump's plans to address an annual rally of anti-abortion demonstrators on Friday in Washington, in what would be the first appearance by a sitting president at the March for Life, one of the movement's marquee events. In 2017, Mike Pence became the first sitting vice president to attend, and the next year, Mr. Trump became the first president to address a rally by video. In a statement, Gene Mancini, the president of March for Life, praised the president for appointing anti-abortion judges, cutting taxpayer funding for abortions in the United States and abroad, and outspokenly opposing late-term abortions. I misjudged the gender effect. The former 2016 party nominee made her long-held private grievances with Mr. Sanders public this week in an interview with The Hollywood Reporter. suggesting that Mr. Sanders' argument that with Miss Warren was part of a pattern of attacks by supporters on his rivals, particularly the woman. Friends of Mrs. Clinton told me she felt compelled to speak out after watching Mr. Sanders refuse to admit any fault in the disagreement with Miss Warren, and then seeing his supporters attack Miss Warren online. A new campaign ad carried a simple message from Miss Warren aimed squarely at those pesky concerns about electability against Mr. Trump. I'm going to beat him. Miss Warren's team, Miss Linsky noted, even handed out jars of nail polish specially made to match the campaign's Liberty Green color scheme. Here's my colleague Astrid W. Herndon with an update from the Warren camp. Today's round of polls produced little good information for Miss Warren's presidential campaign. Emails show budget office working to carry out Ukraine aid freeze. The 192 pages of documents released just before a midnight deadline to the nonprofit group American Oversight do not contain major new revelations in terms of the participants in the aid freeze or the sequence of events beyond what has been detailed by the New York Times in the last month based on interviews and documents. Hi, Scott, the email said, followed by 4 large blacked out areas of text that the White House declined to make public. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks. The White House cited a provision by the Freedom of Information which allows the federal government to withhold deliberate communications, the disclosures of which would inhibit the frank and candid exchange of views that is necessary for effective government decision-making. The emails from July 25th, the same morning Mr. Trump had his phone call with President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine and asked him to look into issues related to the 2016 election in the United States, and to former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr. and his son Hunter Biden show that the administration aides were preparing to carry out Mr. Trump's order for the aid freeze. Where is Kevin? McCarthy finds a place in the Trump campaign. His delivery lacks the razor edge of his fellow House Republican leader Liz Cheney, who announced on Thursday that she would forego a campaign for Wyoming's open Senate seat to remain in the House, a veiled threat to challenge Mr. McCarthy for the speakership if Republicans regain the majority. House Republicans include former prosecutors who probably don't love the president, moderates who are retiring and thinking, I'm going to vote to impeach the president because I want my grandchildren to talk to me again, said John Fury, a Republican strategist, in their book, Young Guns, A New Generation of Conservative Leaders. They portray themselves as reform-minded Republicans who are eager to erase the image of congressional Republicans as big spenders preoccupied with portraying themselves, but with assuring their own re-election. Today, Mr. Cantor and Mr. Ryan are gone, along with many of their small government, free market, pro-trade deals, replaced by Mr. Trump's crackdown on immigrants, his protectionist tariffs, and tax cut and spending deals that have ballooned the federal deficit. Rebuke from Roberts signals his limited role in Trump's Senate trial. Chief Justice Roberts makes only rare public appearances, and the Supreme Court does not allow camera coverage of its arguments. In the 1905 Swain trial, a senator objected when one of the managers used the word pettifogging, and the president's officer said the word ought not have been used. Chief Justice Roberts said in his 2019 report he denounced false information spread on social media and warned against threats to democracy by describing a riot at which John Jay, an author of the Federalist paper, and later the first Chief Justice, was struck in the head by a rock, thrown by a rioter, motivated by a rumor. Jay and his colleagues, Chief Justice Robert wrote, ultimately succeeded in convincing the public of the virtues of the principles embodied in the Constitution. Those principles leave no place for mob violence, the Chief Justice wrote. McConnell prefers to hold them, but also knows when to fold them. Having written the rules mainly in secret, keeping the final text from even many of his fellow Republican senators until the last moment, Mr. McConnell quickly quelled a brewing backlash from his colleagues by agreeing to relax some of the most stringent aspects he had drafted. The move allowed Mr. McConnell to avoid the spectacle of a fracture among Republicans at the outset of the trial, and he was willing to break from the White House plans if needed to do so.
Mr. McConnell has counseled the White House against seeking a quick vote to dismiss the impeachment charges, warning that there was not enough Republican support for doing so before arguments were made at the trial. The new face of white supremacy plots expose danger of the base. If the base can seem large or more or less dangerous than it actually is, this is a boom for the group and one of its primary targets. The base shares some ideological underpinnings and likely some members with Atomwaffen Division, another violent white supremacist neo-Nazi group. Now, these are people who are committed, angry racists who could do the same thing at any time. Members of the base, posting in various chat rooms, wrote messages encouraging violence, according to court documents. In Georgia, the 3 men arrested had, in the presence of an undercover agent, cased the house of a Bartow County couple they planned to shoot dead for being members of Antifa, which had staged counter-demonstrations at right-wing rallies across the country and revealed the identities of base members publicly. Trump dismisses troops' possible brain injuries as headaches. President Trump on Wednesday dismissed concussion symptoms reported by several American troops after Iranian airstrikes on Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq as not very serious, even as the Pentagon acknowledged that a number of servicemen were being examined for possible traumatic brain injury caused by the attack. The Trump administration has initially said that there were no injuries from the Iranian attack. Defense Secretary Mark T. Esper on Wednesday deflected questions from reporters in Pensacola, Florida, after they pointed to Mr. Trump's comments that seemed to dismiss the severity of potential head injuries caused by Iranian attacks. Trump opens door to cuts to Medicaid and other entitlement programs. President Trump suggested on Wednesday that he would be willing to consider cuts to social safety net programs like Medicare to reduce the federal deficit if he wins a second term, an apparent shift from his 2016 campaign promise to protect funding for such entitlements. Mr. Trump's willingness to consider such cuts marks a shift from 4 years ago, when he stood out in a field of deficit-minded Republicans in the 2016 primary race, with a promise to shield entitlements from the cuts. Huckabee is a nice guy, but will never be able to bring in the funds so as not to cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, Trump tweeted. He waterboarded a detainee, then he had to get the CIA to let him stop. Dr. Mitchell said those directing the operations derided the psychologist as pussies and believed that, contrary to a report from the secret CIA prison in Thailand, where they were carrying out the interrogation, Mr. Zubaydah could yield some information about what they feared were looming terrorist attacks. I don't want to use the word perfunctory about something that horrible, Dr. Mitchell said, describing how he held a cloth over the Palestinian prisoner's face as Dr. Jensen did 2 20-second pours, gave the prisoner time to catch his breath, poured water on his face for shorter durations, and then concluded with a final 40-second pour. 7 months later, Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Jensen waterboarded Khalil Sheikh Mohammed, who allegedly led the September 11th, 2001 hijacking plot, 183 times. Some of the folks who were watching were tearful, Dr. Mitchell said, in describing the reaction among the visitors who came to see Mr. Zubaydah's interrogation, including people who had been there all along, who didn't want to see him waterboarded again. I was tearful. I cry at dog food commercials, and it was particularly hard for me to do. I felt sorry for him. Dr. Mitchell said, Mr. Zubaydah. Local prosecutor in Washington sues Trump inaugural committee. The Attorney General, Carl A. Racine, said the committee, which organized Mr. Trump's January 2017 inaugural celebration, vastly overpaid to use ballrooms and meeting rooms at the Trump International Hotel near the White House. The committee operated in compliance with the law, the statement said, adding that the suit reads more like a partisan press release than a legal filing. The inaugural committee raised a record $107 million to celebrate Mr. Trump swearing in. The committee paid the Trump Hotel more than $1 million over a 4-day period for event space, food, and other charges, exceeding even the hotel's own pricing guidelines, but actually used the space for only 2 days, Mr. Racine said. Firefighters shield body trapped in rubble of New Orleans hotel. City officials say the current controlled demolition plan is safer and should not damage surrounding buildings, although 3 would have to be taken down in the process, said Bo Tidwell, communications director for the city of New Orleans. The buildings are owned by members of the hotel's development group, according to the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate, the city's new newspaper. In a Facebook post, organizers of a protest march scheduled for Friday afternoon said they were targeting City Hall in protest of the refusal to hold the buildings accountable for the deaths, injuries, and unsafe work conditions they created. Erica Brown, 34, said Wednesday she would approve the ominous areas beneath the building. She would avoid the ominous areas beneath the building until it comes down. Trump removes pollution control on streams and wetlands. Karen Harbert, chief executive officer of the American Gas Association, said the new rule would restore the proper balance between federal and state regulation of our nation's waters and protect our rivers, streams, and lakes without stifling construction of important infrastructure. The Obama rule protected about 60% of our nation's waterways, including large bodies of water such as the Chesapeake Bay, Mississippi River, and Puget Sound, and smaller headwaters, wetlands, seasonal streams, and streams that run temporarily underground. Ian Thomas Tafoya, a Colorado-based clean water activist with the group Green Latinos, said the new rule could harm the quality of the water in the Colorado River, which supplies water to 17 western states. The EPA Scientific Advisory Board, a panel of 41 scientists responsible for evaluating the scientific integrity of the agency's regulations, concluded that the new Trump water rule ignores science by failing to acknowledge watershed systems. They found no scientific justification for excluding certain bodies of water from protection under the new regulations, concluding that pollutants from those smaller and seasonal bodies of water can still have a significant impact on the health of larger water systems. A Maine paper mill's unexpected savior, China. Mills get torn down or scrapped out, and here's Old Town in the middle of it, coming back to life. The year 2019 was by any measure a disastrous one for the relations between America and China, squeezing the life out of it. As the new year began, the mill still bore a bright 2-story banner that read, "Old Town, New Beginning." The mill restart has proven a struggle as the new owners grappled with equipment that suffered from years of neglect, said Mr. Kreichner, the mill manager. The ambitious 2-year goal, declared at its grand opening to convert the mill from hardwood to softwood, then scale up pulp production from the mill's former yield of 150,000 tons a year to 270,000, is still far off. Supreme Court seems ready to lift limits on state aid to religious schools. The Supreme Court on Wednesday seemed poised to rule that states may not exclude religious schools from the state programs that provide scholarships to students attending private schools. Government spending on public schools, he added, does not require aid to private schools, religious or not. Soon after the program started, a state agency said students attending religious schools were not eligible in light of a provision of the state's constitution that bars the use of government money for any sectarian purpose or to aid any church, school, academy, seminary, college, university, or any literary or scientific institution controlled in whole, in part, by any church, sect, or denomination. 3 mothers with children at Stillwater Christian School in Kalispell, Montana, sued, saying the provisions of the state constitution violated the protections of religious freedom guaranteed by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. There is no such thing as a free tax cut. Republicans have steadily insisted for almost 4 decades that tax cuts are free, even as each new round of tax cuts fails to pay for itself. The longer Congress waits to clean up the damage caused by the tax cuts, the higher the cost will be. The cuts were funded from borrowed money, so the government must spend more on interest payments with each passing year. Gary Kahn, a chief architect of the tax cuts during his time was Mr. Trump's chief economic advisor, argues plausibly that the uncertainty created by Mr. Trump's trade policy has worked against the tax cuts, discouraging companies from making long-term investment. Miss Clinton, you already beat Bernie Sanders. Trump is the opponent now. Worse, Miss Clinton declined to commit to campaigning for Mr. Sanders or even supporting him if he wins the nomination. In the middle of a presidential campaign, does she need to be so distracting? And as a reminder, after the 2016 Democratic Convention, Mr. Sanders campaigned vigorously for Mrs. Clinton. It's because an electoral victory by Mr. Trump and Mr. Sanders made clear when he campaigned for Mrs. Clinton will be too much for the country to bear. What if Trump gave Alaska to Putin? McConnell's grim determination to see no evidence and hear no witnesses is particularly hypocritical because in 1999, during the impeachment trial of President Bill Clinton, he did favor allowing witnesses. Trump's team even suggested that abuse of power itself cannot be grounds for impeachment, calling it House Democrats' newly invented abuse of power theory. Newly invented? Abuse of power was central to the discussions of impeachment at the Constitutional Convention. Alexander Hamilton said that impeachment was a remedy for it, the abuse or violation of some public trust. It was also the basis for articles of impeachment approved by the House Judiciary Committee against both Nixon and Clinton. Trump versus George Washington. Donald Trump took up just a little over 2 hours at his impeachment day rally when he had enough time to suggest Donald Trump took up just a little over 2 hours at his impeachment day rally when he had just enough time to suggest that late Congressman John Dingell went to hell and to call Schiff not exactly the best looking guy we've ever seen. Schiff's mission was to take the Senate and, better yet, the American public through Trump's impeachment behavior step by step. Keeping Donald Trump in office is, of course, critical for McConnell, the man who gets to actually run much of the country, as long as the distracted doofus is in the alleged driver's seat. He's made the occasional burst into public, expressing the wish that he could be right there at the trial where he could sit right in the front row and stare into their corrupt faces. Really try to imagine Donald Trump sitting still for 2.5 hours at anything. Gay men are dying from a crisis we're not talking about. Gay men are more likely to try meth than straight men. I watched gay men suffer from meth addiction for over 20 years. It's only getting worse. Because meth addiction disproportionately affects gay men, it hasn't risen to the level of priority and intervention of other addictions. What Americans can learn from the Chinese. It's a chance for young Chinese people to speak out on important issues, and it's a recognition of the importance of the English-speaking world. Yes, in a world that relies more on English, it's less important for Americans to learn Chinese. An American without Chinese roots who is fluent in Chinese is rare. The number of American students learning Chinese, while growing quickly, is still in the hundreds of thousands. Impeachment trial, the opening round. On Tuesday night, I watched the first day of the Senate impeachment trial, which I felt was not unlike a dissidents' court case in Vietnam. It is likely that no witnesses will be called or documents allowed to be presented. Only state-generated photos and video clips are provided, and a ready-made ruling is seemingly in store. First, a sham House impeachment investigation, now a sham Senate trial. Not only has the Senate begun its impeachment trial as a raw partisan struggle, but the media is doing the same. Hillary Clinton's swipe at Bernie Sanders. I voted for Hillary in 2016 and am undecided as to which Democratic Party candidate I will support in 2020. However, I find Ms. Clinton's comments about Senator Bernie Sanders to be mean-spirited and divisive. Nobody likes him. Millions of people supported his campaign in 2016 and are doing so again in 2020. Furthermore, Mr. Sanders supported and campaigned for Mrs. Clinton after she won the nomination. What a bizarre way to repay that support. Mrs. Clinton could do well to make fewer public comments during the campaign, and when she must comment, she should think before she speaks. We must work for party unity and keeping our eyes on the prize, defeating President Trump. Personal attacks against a leading Democratic candidate will only increase Mr. Trump's chances of winning re-election. Why we need equal rights amendments. Jonesy Williams isn't asking the right questions when she wonders if continuing the effort to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment is a political battle worth waging. More than 90% of the public supports an Equal Rights Amendment. A mass mobilization of activist women is demanding that Equal Rights Amendment be finally enshrined into law. Why shiny new tech companies love old industrial buildings. Loft buildings offer the open, creative, and fun workspaces of Silicon Valley combined with New York City urban industrial feel, said Matt Glickman, a vice president of Snowflake, a California-based software company with a Manhattan loft office. One major developer-related companies, which is building Hudson Yards, the mini-city rising on Manhattan's far west side, is renovating 2 Long Island City loft buildings to offer a more affordable alternative with a short subway ride from Manhattan, said Patrick Sweeney, the managing director. What was once secondary buildings started gaining traction. As Google now expands in Lower Manhattan, it's moving into 2 loft buildings and taking over the commercial space in a third, in a former industrial neighborhood near the Holland Tunnel, that has welcomed newcomers with $27 million in improvements, including a park. Fairway Market files for bankruptcy protection. After careful consideration of all alternatives, we have concluded that a short court-supervised sales process is the best way to meet our objectives of preserving as many jobs as possible, maximizing value of our stakeholders, and positioning Fairway for long-term success under new ownership. Abel Porter, the chief executive of Fairway, said in a statement, "The prices have gone up considerably and the quality has gone down considerably." But another Fairway customer, Merle Gonchar, who said she had been shopping at Fairway since moving to the Upper West Side in 1997, called the store a neighborhood anchor. The main problem for Fairway, he said, were its 2 suburban locations in New Jersey and its branch in Stamford, Connecticut. They have lagged sales and expensive leases. He said, as does Fairway's store in Red Hook, which is in a hard-to-get location far from public transportation and pays about $1.5 million in rent a year. Weinstein trial begins with vivid description of several sexual acts, assaults, attacks. Miss Haste led the jury through Mr. Weinstein's alleged mistreatment of women, beginning in the early 1990s when she said Mr. Weinstein raped Miss Shora, who later became known for her work in The Sopranos. After meeting at an Irish bar in Lower Manhattan, Mr. Weinstein dropped Miss Shora off at her apartment and forced his way inside, Miss Haste said. After a second attack, Miss Haste said, Mr. Weinstein told the actress, "I just find you so attractive I couldn't resist you." Miss Haste told the jury about 3 more women who would testify that Mr. Weinstein attacked them. A second actress who worked as a waitress at a cocktail lounge that Mr. Weinstein frequented will testify that Mr. Weinstein sexually assaulted her after inviting her to his Tribeca apartment for a business meeting, according to Miss Haste. Twitter tells facial recognition trailblazer to stop using the site's photos. Tor Eklund, a lawyer for Clearview, confirmed that it had received Twitter's letter and said the company would respond accordingly. He declined to comment further. Mr. Ton Thought acknowledged that Clearview had amassed its database of photos by scraping them from publicly available websites like Facebook and Twitter. The social media company said such activity would violate their terms of service, and Facebook said it was reviewing the situation with Clearview and will take appropriate action if we find they are violating our rules. It isn't clear what power Twitter and other social media sites have to force Clearview to remove images from their websites. People are calling SWAT teams to tech executives' homes. Swatting is an online lingo used to describe when people call police with false reports of a violent crime of some sort inside a home, hoping to persuade them to send a well-armed SWAT team. The responses include gun emojis, a symbol in swatting forums, for an attack in which the police were successfully called to the target's home. Swatting is not a new thing. It's been around for a long time, and it weaponizes our 9/11 system, but it's a lot more than a hoax or a prank. In addition to the registry, the police department has trained 9/11 operators to pick up cues to potential swatting in calls, Chief Best said. women's gains in the workforce conceal the problem. So yes, it's great to see women participating at such a high level in the market. But it also means continuing challenges for working class families because these jobs just don't replace manufacturing jobs in terms of job quality and wages. Women now hold 50.04% of payroll jobs, according to the Labor Department's jobs reports this month. A new experiment found that when unemployed men look at job postings, they're willing to take a job that employed mostly women. Women who worked in manufacturing were hit harder than men during the recession, but they were also more likely than men to move into high-skilled jobs and healthcare jobs. Tesla value hits $100 billion. Will Elon Musk get a big bonus? The company's stock has doubled, and the doubters are still the doubters. Tesla stock started surging in October when the company reported an unexpected profit for the third quarter after a record $1.1 billion loss in the first half of 2019. As it struggled to produce and deliver its Model 3 sedan. Under its terms, Mr. Musk, who does not take a salary, would be allowed to buy just over 20 million shares of Tesla stock at a deep discount as the company meets a mix of revenue, profit, and valuation targets. Should Tesla achieve all of the goals laid out in the compensation plan, including reaching a $650 billion market capitalization, or roughly double Walmart's valuation today, Mr. Musk could receive up to $55 billion in compensation, a number that could change if the company issues more stock. Trump says the Fed prevented 4% growth. That isn't true. In the most extreme counterfactual one in which the Fed never raised its policy interest rate at all, growth might have been 1 percentage point higher in 2019, said Ernie Tedeschi, policy economist at Evercore IC. That estimate, which he based on the central bank's main economic model, would have gotten America to around 3.2% growth in 2019, but at a hefty cost. Relative to the economic structural growth path, the one driven by labor force expansion and productivity, the Fed's rate setting may have shaved about 0.1 percentage point from growth in 2019, according to an estimate from Julia Coronado, a founder of Macro Policy Perspectives. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that over the next decade, growth will average about 1.9% a year, up slightly from the preceding decade, but down substantially from the 3% and higher growth that prevailed before 2000. Hallmark TV chief leaves after dispute over same-sex wedding ad. Hallmark's top television executive, Bill Abbott, is leaving the company weeks after the Hallmark Channel confronted a withering backlash over its decision to pull commercials that featured a same-sex wedding. The only difference between the commercials that were flagged and the ones that were approved was that the commercials that did not meet Hallmark standards included a lesbian couple kissing. Mike Chi, the chief marketing officer of Zola, said last month, Hallmark approved a commercial where a heterosexual couple kissed. All kisses, couples, and marriages are equal celebrations of love, and we will no longer be advertising on Hallmark. Days later, Mr. Perry called the decision to drop the commercials a wrong decision and apologized for the hurt it unintentionally caused. A representative for Hallmark said neither Mr. Abbott nor Mr. Perry were available to comment for this article. PG&E announces deal to exit bankruptcy, but governor balks. Until Wednesday, PG&E and its bondholders had competing plans for sorting out the company's finances.
Reaching a resolution with the bondholder group is a positive development to move forward with our plan to reorganize, said Bill Johnson, president and chief executive of the utility parent company, PG&E Corporation. While PG&E has made substantial progress in resolving victim claims and restructuring our finances, additional changes to the plan are forthcoming. We will continue to engage with the governor's office to address his concerns, the company said. In Davos, President Trump frets about Boeing. Later on Wednesday, Mr. Trump brought up Boeing again, calling it a very disappointing company. In an interview on CNBC, he cited Boeing as one of the reasons the United States economy didn't perform better in 2019.
we're fully focused on the safe return to service of the 737 MAX, and we're taking actions across the company to strengthen our safety culture, improve transparency, and re-earn the trust that our customers, regulators, government leaders, suppliers, and the public. At a news conference just before leaving Davos, Mr. Trump brought up Boeing for at least a third time in the day. Mr. Trump said Airbus is doing better than ever because Boeing has not had a good time of it, adding that Boeing had better start to recover fast. I hope they do, Mr. Trump said. GM's Cruise unveils a self-driving car. Don't look for it on the roads. Cruise, the autonomous vehicle division of General Motors, unveiled an ambitious new vehicle on Tuesday that the executive said was the beginning of the future beyond the car. Emphasis on beginning. The futuristic electric vehicle, the Cruise Origin, has a long road to travel before any passengers will be able to hail a ride in it. Cruise's plan is not to sell the vehicles, but to operate a system of autonomous taxis, essentially robo-taxis, that can be hailed via an app. Cruise's executive said their vehicle was designed to last for 1 million miles, far longer than typical cars. Put Alexa and Siri to work. Your first assistant is likely to be one that came with your phone, tablet, or computer. Like Apple's Siri, Google's Assistant, Microsoft's Cortana, or Samsung's Bixby, voice assistants on smart speakers have also become the control hubs for wireless connected devices like light bulbs, streaming TV boxes, thermostats, and other smart home appliances. Amazon's site has an Alexa skills guide for the assistant's thousands of voice apps, or you can just say, Alexa, help me get started with skills. By linking skills together, you can also set up routines for multiple tasks at one command, like easing you into the day with your favorite morning news podcast, turning on the smart coffee maker, and gently increasing the brightness on your connected lighting system. France says U.S. talks could produce agreement on digital taxes. Negotiations over an international tax scheme might also deal with the global minimum tax on corporations' overseas profits, such as one approved in the United States in 2017. A global minimum corporate tax, which addresses issues like double taxation and tax avoidance, would affect a much broader swath of companies than a strictly digital tax. For a minimum tax rate, he said, I've already given a number around 12.5% as possible. Mr. Lemaire made it clear that digital tax issue was far from resolved. Major insurer pledges $55 million to try to lower generic drug prices. A major group of insurers said it would invest $55 million to create cheaper versions of expensive generic drugs for which there is little competition, in a further sign of dissatisfaction with the pharmaceutical industry's price-setting practices. Frustrated with high drug prices, especially on essential medicines like insulin, state and federal lawmakers have signaled interest in manufacturing generic medications to try to lower costs for millions of Americans. Governor Gavin Newsom of California recently floated a similar proposal in which states would contract with outside manufacturers to sell generic drugs under the state's own label. And that has been Reading the Times for Thursday, January 3rd, 2020.